Welcome, students, to our last chapter, which is exercise 35, which focuses on the lymphatic system and kind of a basic immune response. In terms of what the lymphatic system looks like, it's a series of vessels that end up collecting the fluid that leaks out of our blood vessels and returning it to our circulatory system, as well as some organs like the bone marrow, the spleen, the thymus, that essentially provide the kind of structural framework for our immune system. That they hold all the immune cells. They act as like a lookout tower. If you think of our immune system as kind of our body's army that helps keep us safe and protected, the lymphoid organs are almost like the guard tower that the immune cells get to sit in so that they can surveil our body and help keep us safe. We're going to look at the system of collecting vessels first, and then talk about some of the lymphoid organs. So essentially what happens when your organs are perfused with blood is blood goes out to those organs, it filters out at the capillaries, but not all of the fluid that filters out at the capillaries can make it back into circulation. Some of it ends up kind of stuck almost, or would be stuck, except for the fact that there's another collection system, and that's this lymphatic system. If we did not have the lymphatic system, then the fluid that filters out at your blood capillaries that doesn't make it back into your blood capillaries and doesn't make it back into the circulatory system would end up causing edema, kind of this excess fluid in our tissues. But luckily, that doesn't happen most of the time because we do have this series of lymphatic vessels. So that fluid, which is essentially blood plasma, a little bit other stuff, it's not quite blood plasma, but it's fairly similar in kind of composition. We call that fluid lymph once it has entered this series of collecting vessels. And they essentially just get bigger and bigger. So it's very similar to the venous system. It's a one-way flow only. So unlike the blood system, which flows out from the heart and back, lymph fluid flow is only one way. It's only from the tissues through the collecting vessels and eventually returned to our venous circulation. So it's a one-way flow. The system starts with the lymphatic capillaries and then moves into the lymphatic collecting vessels, which then merge with lymphatic trunks, which then merge with lymphatic ducts, and the ducts then dump the lymph fluid into the venous circulation and returns all that fluid back to our circulatory system. That happens to take place at the junction between the internal jugular and the subclavian vein in your neck. So the lymph fluid is returned to the venous circulation very close to where the venous circulation returns to the heart. The lymph itself is also kind of filtered. There are lymph nodes, one of our lymphoid organs, kind of scattered throughout this collecting vessel system, which acts like a nice filter in our system to make sure that the lymph fluid has been essentially cleansed of things that might potentially be harmful to us. So if we start with the capillaries, you'll see that how they're kind of interwoven among the blood capillaries. They're actually much more permeable than the blood capillaries themselves. When there's a lot of fluid in the area, the lymph capillaries will actually like open up almost and allow all kinds of stuff to get into the lymph system. The lymphatic capillaries then merge with what we call lymphatic collecting vessels. These are very similar to the veins in our body. The walls are a little bit thinner. They have more anastomosing, some more kind of junctions and connections than veins. But like the veins, they do also rely on skeletal milking and the fact that they have these nice little one-way valves in them to make sure that the lymph is flowing in that kind of one-way direction. It's actually one of the reasons why if you exercise when you're not feeling well, it's actually good for you because the skeletal milking from the exercise actually gets the lymph kind of flowing through the system more rapidly and can promote better healing. The lymphatic vessels then merge with the lymphatic trunks, and they are named for whichever part of the body they happen to drain. So the left jugular trunk does the left side of the head and neck. The right bronchomediastinal trunk does the right side of the kind of thorax area. The left lumbar trunk does the lower limb on the left side. The intestinal trunk does kind of the abdomen. So they're named for whichever kind of area they happen to drain on both sides of the body. The lymphatic trunks then merge with the lymphatic ducts, and there are two of them. There is a right lymphatic duct, which drains the right head and kind of thorax area, and then the right upper arm. The left duct is actually not the left duct, but it's actually the thoracic duct. But it does every other part of the body. So it does left head and neck and left limb, as well as all of the lower areas. So the right lymphatic duct only drains the head and neck and right upper limb. All of the lower part of the body, as well as the left upper body, drain into this thoracic duct right here. And the thoracic duct actually starts out as this kind of larger sac called the cisterna chyle. So it's a little different. So there's a right lymphatic duct that only does kind of upper, and then the thoracic duct that does left, upper, and lower. So that's the series of lymphatic vessels that collect the fluid. The other thing that the lymph system does for us is it houses our immune cells. And when we're talking about immune cells, primarily we're talking about lymphocytes, one of our types of white blood cells. Lymphocytes are kind of, if you think of your immune system as the army, right, then the lymphocytes are kind of like the main warriors for the army. They will protect against anything that your body perceives as foreign. Now, the trigger for this protection are antigens. So antigens that are from foreign bacteria or viruses or parasites, but even antigens from mismatched red blood cells, or perhaps your own self cells that are that have turned cancerous, and those cancerous antigens can trigger an immune response as well. But that's really what the immune system is responding to, are these different antigens. We have two main varieties of lymphocytes. We have T cells and B cells. T cells provide what we call cellular immunity, because the T cells themselves can actually go and attack something that is potentially damaged to us. Some sort of infected cell can actually be attacked by a T cell. B cells provide what we call humoral immunity, because what B cells do is they actually mature into what we call plasma cells, and then the plasma cells make antibodies, little proteins that actually go and basically put a flare on some infected cell and says, oh, hey, this thing is toxic and we have to get rid of it. So if you see this thing, please get rid of it, other immune cells. So the B cells themselves don't actually go and attack the infected cells. It's more of an indirect mechanism. It works through this production of these antibodies, which very often travel in the blood, in the plasma, and blood used to be called humor, so it's humoral immunity. It's more indirect. Whereas the T cells, the cellular immunity, the T cells themselves can actually go and attack and get rid of something that might be harmful to us. So these lymphocytes are housed in our lymphoid organs. And lymphoid organs come in two varieties, what we call primary lymphoid organs and secondary lymphoid organs. The primary lymphoid organs are the thymus and the red bone marrow. The red bone marrow is where both T cells and B cells originate. It's where they're made. But then the B cells stay in the bone marrow, right? B for bone marrow. Whereas the T cells, they actually recirculate to the thymus, right? T cells for thymus. And that is where the B cells and T cells mature. So the B cells mature in the bone marrow, the T cells mature in the thymus. The secondary lymphoid organs are where these now mature T cells and B cells might encounter the antigen that they respond to, where they might become activated and kind of go charging after something. So secondary lymphoid organs include the lymph nodes, the tonsils, the spleen, the appendix, actually, and the Peyer's patches. For the longest time, we thought the appendix was a vestigial organ, not something that we needed, but in more recent years, they have discovered that not much as an adult, it's still not really necessary as an adult because we've got more fully functioning immune systems, but embryonically, the appendix is a major source of kind of fetal immune cells that help keep the fetus safe when it's in the uterus. So it's not quite vestigial. So those are kind of our two classes of the lymphoid organs. And we're going to talk about a couple, and you'll get a chance to see several of them in the lab. Starting with the lymph nodes. So these are found kind of scattered throughout the series of collecting vessels, kind of deep in our connective tissue, and then we have clusters in the inguinal, axillary, and cervical regions, right? Sometimes if you've ever had an infection, right, the doctor will kind of like massage your neck and try to see if your lymph nodes are swollen, because if your lymph nodes are swollen, it could be that they are very active at that point in time because you have an infection. They are kind of the primary secondary lymphoid tissue. This is one of the best places where immune cells might encounter something foreign to us because they are scattered along the lymph system. And since the lymph system is transporting all that fluid, it's a really good chance that immune cells here in the lymph nodes might encounter their antigen, so that they can kind of mount in a response to that. We find both T cells and B cells particularly B cells in the lymph nodes, but we also find macrophages, which are basically little Pac-Man cells that can eat debris. We find them here in the lymphatic nodes as well. So the lymph fluid flows into the lymph node through the afferent lymphatic vessels and then flows out of the lymph node through the efferent lymphatic vessels. And you'll see there are many more afferent vessels than there are efferent vessels. That slows the flow, kind of like it slows, like the flow of traffic. That allows the immune cells that are here more opportunity to kind of surveil the lymph fluid and see if there's something that is harmful to us. So like many organs, there is both an outer cortex and an inner medulla. In the cortex, it gets separated into these little kind of almost little like nodes by these trabeculae. Well, smack dab in the middle of that is what we call a lymphoid follicle. And in the middle of that follicle is the germinal center, where we have lots and lots and lots and lots of B cells kind of hanging out, looking for something that they might be able to mount a response to. In the medulla, the cells are kind of laid out in rows with the kind of sinuses between them, and the medulla we're much more likely to find kind of debris-eating macrophages than the B lymphocytes. And you can see that here histologically. So here is our cortex with all of the follicles with the germinal centers in the middle, and then it's a much looser collection of tissue here with the cords of kind of macrophage cells separated out by all this sinus through which the lymph is flowing. You also need to get a chance to look at the spleen, which has one of the richest kind of blood supplies of any organ in your body. So the splenic artery brings all the blood into it, and the splenic vein drains it. Part of the reason the spleen gets such a big blood supply is that this is kind of the graveyard for our red blood cells. So spleen tends to have kind of two distinct tissues. The white pulp, which surrounds these central arteries, so you can see here is a central artery and the white pulp kind of surrounding it. The white pulp is where the immune cells are, but most of the mass of the spleen is actually red pulp, and this is where red blood cells get recycled, bacteria, viruses, debris, it all gets recycled here, and so since this is kind of the graveyard for your old red blood cells, that's why the spleen needs such a rich blood supply. If we look then at the tonsils, these are the simplest of our lymphoid organs. They are way up here in our oral cavity and a little bit around in our pharynx. They're named according to kind of where they are found, right? So the palatine tonsils are at the back of the palate. Those are the largest of your tonsils, so they're also the ones that tend to get infected the most often if you have tonsillitis. The lingual tonsil, which is back here behind the tongue, and then the pharyngeal tonsils up here kind of at the kind of roof of the nasopharynx. If you've ever heard the term adenoids, that's the other term for pharyngeal tonsils. I've actually had my adenoids, my pharyngeal tonsils removed as a kid. So if you've ever had that happen, or if you've ever heard that term adenoids, that's what we're talking about. So we're talking about these pharyngeal tonsils here. The reason we have a collection of lymph cells in our mouth is this is where we put food in our mouth, right? This is a potential source for something that might be harmful to us. Since this is a potential source of something that might be harmful to us, it is very helpful to have a bunch of lymphocytes, again, germinal centers, lymphoid follicles, so collections of B cells that might be able to attack something and kind of target something that might be toxic to us. The tonsils also have kind of these indentations in their epithelial tissue called what we call tonsillar crypts, which essentially just trap the bacteria and allow the immune cells in the germinal cells plenty of time to go after the bacteria. The last of the lymphoid organs that we're going to look at is the thymus, and the thymus is particularly important. It is where our T cells mature and develop, but the thymus is particularly important in infancy and childhood. The thymus increases in size all throughout childhood. It's also when it's most active, but when you hit adolescence, the thymus sort of stops growing and will eventually atrophy to a much smaller size. Now, it's still doing its job of producing mature immunocompetent T cells, but it's just not doing so at nearly as much of an active rate as when we're growing. There is a cortex portion of the thymus that is more superficial. This is where we're going to find lots of lymphocytes, lots of macrophages, and then deep in the medulla, you're going to find less of these lymphocytes, but what you will find are these little thymic corpuscles. And the thymic corpuscles help our regulatory T cells develop. Regulatory T cells are a particular type of T cell that helps prevent autoimmune disorders. So when our immune system attacks our own body, that's usually a failure in the regulatory T cell development. So it's that's what the thymic corpuscles do. So the thymus is incredibly, incredibly important. If you've ever heard of like bubble boy disease, where I think there was even a movie about it, perhaps. I may be remembering that wrongly, but I think there was. The kid was born without a thymus, and like has to spend his whole life in quarantine essentially because he doesn't have a functioning immune system because he has no place for his T cells to develop. And that's really kind of the main lymphoid organs. The second part of exercise 35 has to deal with the immune response, and we're going to deal with that in a separate lecture.